Bienvenidos a mi podcast del papel al aula conmigo, con Macanali. En esta ocasión les voy a presentar una conferencia que presentó el doctor Punya Mishra de la Universidad de Michigan, que se llama La enseñanza creativa con tecnología. Introducción al marco de referencias TPACK. Esta conferencia se llevó a cabo en el 2012 en la Universidad de Barcelona, en el tercer Congreso Europeo de Tecnologías de la Información en la Educación y en la Sociedad. Una visión crítica. Yo creo que es un modelo, es un marco de referencia que sigue siendo vigente, y muy útil a la hora que estamos concibiendo cómo es que se integra la tecnología, la educación y qué tenemos que tomar en cuenta. Pienso que es muy relevante y ojalá les guste y les sirva de algo. Muchas gracias y adelante.
Continuamos con la segunda ponencia y, en primer lugar, también agradecer al profesor Punya Mishra haber aceptado la invitación del comité organizador para participar en nuestro congreso. Pensamos realmente que su perfil, su trayectoria, encajan muy bien en esta visión crítica y de mirada abierta, amplia, que intentamos que esté permanentemente a lo largo de estos 3 días presente entre nosotros. El profesor Mishra es doctor en psicología educativa, es profesor en tecnología educativa y también de psicología de la educación en la Universidad de Michigan. En esta misma universidad, director del máster en artes en tecnología educativa y, evidentemente, con las personas que se mueven o nos movemos en el ámbito académico, autor de múltiples artículos en revistas científicas, capítulos de libros, de todo lo cual yo destacaría, en su caso, que la tecnología no aparece como tecnología, no es lo importante, sino está como un elemento, y especialmente en el caso del profesor Mishra, como elemento para la creación, para el diseño, para el arte, para la educación. Cuenta también con más de 150 comunicaciones en congresos, reuniones científicas de distinta índole, es diseñador de espacios web, de software, pero me gustaría también destacar alguna característica quizás más peculiar de su perfil y señalaría que es ante todo un pensador, un creador polifacético, al que le gusta, y esto no lo digo yo, sino que lo dice él mismo, jugar con las ideas, con las palabras, con las imágenes, y siempre con una gran fascinación por la recursividad, por la ambigüedad. Antes hacía referencia con la profesora Collis a que visitaran su página web si no lo habían hecho. Hago lo mismo con el profesor Punya. No lo hagan ahora, al finalizar en todo caso. Que entren porque van a encontrar espacios, yo creo, que muy interesantes. Naveguen, rastreen, si no le conocen su perfil, yo creo que es muy interesante y me atrevo, y espero que no le sepa mal tampoco, que vayan en particular a su espacio, y yo creo que lo debe apreciar muchísimo el Galimufri, y disfruten con sus creaciones fotográficas, sus fotomosaicos, sus ambigramas, sus poesías con palíndromos o demás producciones que ahí ustedes van a encontrar. Como decía, háganlo más tarde y ahora le vamos a escuchar en su ponencia de enseñanza creativa con la tecnología. Con tecnología, la propuesta TPACK.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I should just pack up and leave now because the bar has been set too high for me to. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a wonderful, extravagant introduction. I'm starting with a couple of quotes here that one of my favorites one is this by George Bernard Shaw, which he said that when he heard that India and Britain were being connected by transatlantic cable, he said, that's wonderful, but what are they going to talk about? And when we look at all these technologies and all that we have today, one we often wonder is what we're going to do with this stuff, right? So the second one is T. Nelson, who, Theodore Nelson, came up with the idea of hypertext, said that technicalities matter a lot, but the unifying vision matters even more. The idea that it's not the cables and the wires and the circuits and so on that make up these things, it is the connections that we make and what is the sort of vision that we have for this thing. And the third, this is Douglas Hofstadter, cognitive scientist, and I love this because it's sort of a pun, which you know about the whole being the sum of its parts. I don't know how this is going to translate in Spanish, so bear with me. But he says the soul is greater than the hum of its parts, that when we put the pieces together, particularly in fields like education that we are in, it's the coming together of these ideas and the way they work together that is maybe more important. My contact information is here. I'm always available by email and so on, so feel free. I don't tweet a lot, but you can follow me on Twitter if you want. Okay, start with this quote that the introduction of the use of the internet may prove to be an event as epochal as the application of the wheel or steam power to the industrial age. All right, so how many of you agree with this quote? Can I see a show of hands? Nobody agrees with it. Good. Okay, that's fine. We'll come to that. So that's good. All right. So so thank you for inviting me to the conference. All of you, the organizers, and everybody else. Particularly, this is my first time in Spain, so that's wonderful. Barcelona in particular. I'll show some examples later of things that I did the first day I was here. I also want to apologize for my linguistic incompetence. English is pretty much the only language that I speak with any level of fluency, and a special thanks to the two people in the back. I went and apologized to them in the beginning because I have a style of presentation which I think does not work very well for being translated on the fly. So best of luck. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Start with a little bit about myself and my dream. My dream is actually to be on The Simpsons. So if you've seen the show, that's what I would look like if I were in The Simpsons. But you can go make your own avatar. If you want, there's a website for it, as always. I'm sure there is an app for it, too, now. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. That's our Spartans, And I would be remiss if I did not mention my friend and colleague, without whom none of the work I think that I've done would have the level of quality that he does. He is my quality control. I joke that we are like a hot air balloon. Well, I am the hot air, and he's the ballast. So if left to myself, I would just float away. So he keeps me honest. So that's Dr. Matthew Koehler. As you can see, he's a very good-looking guy with sunglasses and without sunglasses, too. And one of the things that we do together, we talk a lot and we work a lot around the area of technology and education, specifically on what is it that teachers need to know. So that's what I'm going to talk about. My talk is pretty much in three parts. First part sort of giving almost, I think, a repetition in some way of some of the themes and ideas that have happened over the last couple of days. And then move on to explaining this thing called the TPACK framework, and finally talk a little bit about some of the more current work I'm doing around creativity and design and so on. But I want to come back to this quote. So this quote essentially is saying that this network would be bigger than the wheel or the steam engine. All right? So that's what it's saying. Most of you didn't agree with it, which is great because I lied. Because that quote was not really about the internet. Can anybody guess what that quote was really about? Blackboard, okay, what else? Books, okay. Well, I'll let the secret out. It was about the talking picture, all right? And this was in a nice academic book published in 1933 by the University of Chicago Press, some professor just like me, talking about technology and learning, and said, oh, this thing is going to be so good for education, right? And how much of a difference has it made to education? People have talked yesterday that you could go back 500 years and you could go back 20 years. classrooms haven't changed all that much, right? So clearly this is one prediction that didn't work out. So what have we learned from this quick history lesson? We have learned humility, which means any predictions that we make about technology, we need to be humble about it, understand that the forces, I mean, I don't mean it in a bad way, that institutional change in society and so on takes time. It is a long drawn out process. And sometimes it doesn't happen the way we think it would, because I think sometimes we misunderstand sort of the way this whole process works. I think part of the problem when it comes to technology and learning is that it's a question of how we frame it. Because framing, the way you frame the issue becomes really important, specifically when it comes to technology, because it influences what we see, what we see and what we do, the kinds of decisions we take. Technology is expensive, which means that it takes, influences decisions we take about funding. And one of the problems that we've talked about often is this idea of a technocentric frame, which puts technology at the center. So I'm going to question this frame in three, sort of build a threefold argument about it. The first argument against the technocentric frame has to do with how rapidly technology is changing. So if you see, there are those who might argue that not much has changed. If you look at the first one and the last one, the pose is pretty much still the same, all of us crouching like that. But things have changed, and this is one of my favorite charts, which looks at how many generations have gone by as new technologies have come along, okay? So, and a generation, according to my trusted source, Wikipedia, is around 25 to 30 years, okay? So, if you look at 10,000 generations ago, and that's not a long time when you think about it, speech. That's what makes us human, that's what separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom, was just 10,000 generations ago. So oral culture, the idea that we can transfer information, from one person to the other, and knowledge can be transferred that way, is not very long ago. You had to wait another 9,250 years before the next big thing, agriculture, comes along. And agriculture, when you think about it, leads to the division of labor, right? So which somebody is going and hunting, somebody is farming, somebody is making pots, and somebody's taking care of the children. And so as educators, we sort of start appearing in a formal sense just around 750 generations ago. The next huge thing, of course, is writing, which is prehistory, and history is defined by that point, because now we have a record. We can leave behind our ideas for the next generation. We can share it with a wider population. So it's a huge, huge change in human culture. I'm going to jump ahead a few. Printing. And the person yesterday at the reception talked about how the Gutenberg revolution was the biggest thing, technological change ever. And think about that. I mean, it's only post-Gutenberg that you have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Renaissance, Reformation. All that comes from this idea of printing, that you can take ideas and put them in these little black squiggles and share them with the world. The idea that all men are created equal, even though it's a sexist statement at some level, that all humans are created equal, cannot happen without the technology of print, because for once we don't have somebody determining for us what we ought to know, what we can know, and so on. Everybody has the right to that information. So that's a really, really powerful thing. One of the funny stories here is that when I first moved to the US, we didn't have much money. We were graduate students, so we used to go to this garage sales to buy, I used to love to buy books. And for 25 cents, I bought the Communist Manifesto. And I thought, isn't that interesting? I come to the bastion of capitalism and I buy the Communist Manifesto for 25 cents. I still have that book with me, and I think that's really interesting. And if you think about the ideas in that book, whether you agree or disagree with them, that's not the point, but historically they have led to so much change in the world. That's the power of print as a medium, right? And when you think about these new technologies that are coming along, computers around 2 generations ago, you start wondering about what the influence of that is going to be. Internet and email is 1 generation ago. How many of you have teenage children? How many of you can communicate with them by email? Do they check their email? My kids don't check email. It's either Facebook or texting. So email is now for old people, which I think is kind of sad, because for me it's still very cool. It's like, wow, I can send email, And for most people it's like, well, for my kids it's like very boring. And the world that they live in is a world that looks like this, right? And this is still happening. We are in the middle of it. So 2 points here is that change is continuous, and change is becoming faster and faster. If you look at the gaps between those times, things are becoming faster and faster. So this is sort of the world that our kids today are living in. And the question we all have to ask ourselves as educators, as teacher educators, as academics, as scholars, is what does this mean? What does Wikipedia mean? What does World of Warcraft mean? What does Facebook mean? Does it mean anything for us, or does it not? Then you have things like Web 2.0. And one of the most amazing things, I was telling my son that you're going to look back on 2011 and 20 years from now and say, man, I was alive at that time when this happened. Okay? And this happened in large part because of a young man in Harvard thought that he should make something which would allow people to date each other, right? Facebook comes out of that. And through that, and through Twitter, if somebody would have told you, I'm going to make a technology which allows people to send 145 characters, and you'd say, what a stupid idea. Because it is a stupid idea at one level, right? But at another level, it's changing the world. So when I was growing up, if I had to get books to read in India, it was very expensive and difficult, so I'd have to take a bus in Delhi and go to either the USIS or British Council and check out books and bring them back, and I could do it only once a month. So information used to come at me like this, right? And how is it this way today? It's sort of like that. And so if you're a teacher and these technologies are changing so fast, I'm not surprised that you would feel like this. And I think you might recognize it from University of Twente, where I was walking around once. Yes, and I come across this building. I said, oh my God, somebody's drowning. Turned out it's a sculpture. So I went back 6 months later when it was winter and he was still there. So what this means, okay, thank you. It's a little lag here, All right. So what this means is that we have to rethink how we think about technology because of the change, the fast rate of change, and so on. So in terms of rethinking technology, ask this question about what is an educational technology, okay? So here are all these different things, everything from CD-ROMs to the Kinect that connects to the Xbox, to the iPhone, Facebook, a magnifying glass, a crayon. Are these all examples of educational technology? And one of the things that I have been arguing is there is no such thing really as an educational technology. That what we have are a variety of technologies that are out there in the world, and we pick and choose from them and customize them and make them work somehow for our benefit. So I want to build that argument. This is a scientific calculator. You can go to the library or look online. People have written dissertations on how it can be used to teach mathematics and so on. The only problem today is that it is what I call a single function device. And the world that we live in today is like this. Is this an MP3 player? Is this a cell phone? Is this a calculator? If you turn it on its side, it becomes a scientific calculator. You can download apps. What is this device, and what does it mean for this device to enter into our classroom? I think that's a really significant question we have to ask. And whenever I talk to educators about it, they always say this. They say, oh, once these devices, whether you call it a laptop or you call it an iPad or an iPhone, who cares, right? Or an Android device, they say we lose control. And by control, they mean that when I am teaching the Pythagorean theorem, somebody is on YouTube, somebody is texting somebody else. And I say that is not real control, loss of control. The real loss of control is when you are teaching the Pythagorean theorem, somebody has gone online and found a different proof, one that you are not familiar with. That is true loss of control. Because suddenly you have moved from that pedestal of all-knowing to a point where the students are contributing, are a part of that. That's a fundamental shift, I think, in the way we think about technology and what the role it can play. So the problem, I think the big problem when it comes to technology is that most technologies are not designed for education. Okay? Most of the tools that we have around us, everything from Microsoft Word to Gmail to Twitter to Facebook to whatever, Microsoft Excel, Google Spreadsheet, you name it, right? But here's the positive part, is that as users, we are always redefining technologies. That's something we do very naturally. We want to prop a door open, we take a chair and put it there. Nobody told us that a chair should not be used for this, right? We just do it. Okay? So here are some of my favorite examples of reusing technologies, repurposing technologies. So one of my favorite ones is email. How many of you have sent email to yourself? Wow. Now, if I'm walking on the street and I see somebody talking to themselves, I'm going to cross the street. You know, because I don't want to be with somebody who's talking to themselves. But we've all done this, right? Why do we do it? We use it as a memory device. We send it, you know, to send files to ourselves. We do it to, I have this to-do list that I maintain on my email. So again, email was not designed for that, but very naturally we take it to make it do all kinds of different things. So I collect examples of this sort. So here is one, which is a bicycle and a lawnmower. Another one, this is a Chinese restaurant where they use clothespins that you use to dry your clothes to keep track of orders. Works very well. Again, another restaurant, this time in Taiwan, where they use pushpins to tell which tables are filled or not. My favorite one is this. This is called a Maruta, and this is basically a truck built out of junk. So you go to this is in India and China, you find these things where you take a part here, part there, tie it together somehow, and it goes at like 5 miles per hour, and then a piece falls off, and then you tie it back again, but it works, okay? And as educators, that's how we live. You know, we go in with a lesson plan and something happens, and what do? You don't pack up and say, okay, next week. No. You figure something out, right? So I think this is important because only repurposing makes a technology an educational technology. It's only when we take these things that are out there in the world and we see possibilities, we see potential. We say, oh my God, with this digital camera, I can do this in my geometry class. And I'll show you an example of something like that later. So we do that all the time. So if you look at Microsoft Excel, okay, mathematics classrooms, teachers across the world use it. And it's the worst thing. It's not designed for children. The cells are too small, there are too many options, children get lost. But why do we use it? Because it's on every machine. Now it's Google Spreadsheets and it's free, so it's all even better, right? So I think, but that's a reality. My favorite example of how teachers repurpose technology has to do with textbooks. So if one thing has been designed specifically for your classroom, at least that's what the textbook author says, is this was written for this level course, and here are all the consultants who worked on it, and blah, 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 right? And what do? You go into class and you say, we'll read chapter 1 and 2, and then 3.1, 3.2, skip the rest because it's stupid, and here are some websites that I want you to look at to complement what you are repurposing something that has been designed just for your classroom. So to expect other tools and technologies which are not designed for you, that's silly. And this repurposing is a creative and an innovative act, and the teacher plays a critical role in that. So that brings me back to one of my passions, which is working with teachers, whether it's K-12, school, or it's, higher ed. I love doing that. And one of the problems that I've always had is a lot of times technology conversations tend to argue for this thing called a teacher-proof curriculum. And I think that's a real problem because the teacher is the crucial mediator between the technology, the content to be covered, the medium and technology and the pedagogy that we have in order to transform it for the students. So which brings me to the third point, which has to do with questioning technocentrism, is that if we focus inordinately on the technology, we miss content and pedagogy. We miss two of the most important things that are required for good teaching. There was, I don't know how many of you know this report, the CITES 2006 report, and this is a pretty good report. It had 35,000 teachers from 9,000 schools across 22 countries looking at ICT use and so on, right? And here are one of the key findings that emerged from that. That increased technology use did not lead to positive outcomes in student learning. Okay, so no real surprise there, which means if you're just using it, it's not going to help. That effectiveness of technology use depended on the teaching approaches used in conjunction with the technology, which means if your teaching changed when this new technology came in, then it made a difference. So in other words, if you're not going to change pedagogy, then technology use makes no significant difference. Okay? Which means once these tools and devices enter into your classroom, they change the dynamic in certain ways that you have to change the other pieces that are working out there. You can't do the same old thing. And so the way we represent that is that technology and pedagogy is two separate circles, let's say, of knowledge, that it is that intersection that becomes very important. And I'll talk a little bit more about all these different intersections. So clearly, we need to move beyond this idea of I love technology, right? Because technology does a couple of things when it comes to pedagogy and content, is that one, technology changes how we teach, okay? So I think the greatest innovation that we have seen in our lifetimes with respect to technology is this one, okay? The fact that a kid sitting in Botswana, somebody sitting in India, in Europe, has access to information at a scale never, ever before possible in the human race. I don't think we think about that often enough, what an amazingly mind-blowing thing it is. We can talk as much as we want about, can we trust this information, can we do this? The point is that for the first time we have a resource that is just never existed before. And which, of course, has challenges because, there are facts out there. How do you interpret the facts? So that, that's where the teacher comes in. That's where the educator comes in. And so that leads to what I call Punya's laws of parenting, number 23. Okay? And that is that for facts, go to Google. For wisdom, come to me. Okay? So remember that. And that number 23, I like prime numbers, so that's why I throw that in there. It's not that I have 22 others. So that's something else that will come up, 37 or something, so it's all right. Okay. If you look at something like Google with open courseware, with, I'm not shilling for Khan Academy, but with resources of that nature, Web 2.0, things like bring your own device. This used to be, when I was growing up, it was BYOB, bring your own booze when you went to a party. But I think children are changing. It's okay, device is better than booze, I guess. If you look at the growth of online learning, that clearly that intersection now is very different from what it was prior to these changes, whether we like it or not. And not to take advantage of it seems to be wrong to me. The second piece, and that's not a small but, it's a big but, that we should talk about, is that teaching is always about something. You don't teach nothing. You don't go there and teach and technology. That's not it, right? The main thing is that it is about content. It's about something that you want to convey. And Howard Gardner talks about that one of the greatest inventions of humankind is this idea of disciplinary knowledge. Because disciplines teach us how to see the world. They do that by constructing knowledge for specific purposes, using methods and techniques, and different representational forms. So if you think about art, the kind of knowledge that art generates, the kind of purposes it is used for, the kinds of methods that we have of developing artistic knowledge, and the kinds of forms of representation are very different than mathematics. Mathematics is about symbols and mathematical thinking. Art is about expression. So all of those things change. And to expect that technologies and pedagogies would apply the same way, given this diversity, I think is wrong. Now, what's interesting is that simply knowing a discipline is not the same as teaching it. We have all seen faculty members or professors who are excellent in the work that they do, but they cannot teach because they haven't developed the way of taking their ideas and seeing it from the point of view of a learner. And this was Schulman's idea of pedagogical content knowledge, that good teaching is about taking content and transforming it in order to communicate with a student. So coming back to technology and what we teach as opposed to how we teach, if you look at any discipline in the world, you'll see it has been fundamentally changed because of technology. My wife is a graphic designer, and her field is completely different today than it was when she studied. When she studied, they used to literally do cut and paste. That's where it comes from. You cut and you paste. make a poster. And now she does Apple X and Apple V, right? And she hates it. She really wants to work with paper in her hand and so on. But that's changed. Mathematicians don't do mathematics the same way anymore. Scientists don't do it anymore. No, musicians create music on the computer today, right? So every aspect has changed fundamentally. So I was at the University of Twente a few years ago, and I wanted to give an example of how technology has changed the way the world looks, and I wanted to give a local example. And so I found this, right, the microscope. And I said, look at how the microscope was discovered, and I did not know how to pronounce that name. So I didn't have you there, so I went online. And somebody in Boston had gone and had the same question and was not lazy like me, actually went and interviewed people and put it on as an MP3. So here it is.
Antonie van Leeuwenhoek.
Did you hear that? So I said, this is so cool. How did they know that I will need it 5 years later? But that's the beauty of the internet, right? That people do these things and put it out there. One of my favorite examples of how technology has changed representation is this one. This is the periodic table of elements. So you're supposed to go like in rows this way. And then once you reach here, you're supposed to jump over here, go this row, then come back here. And there's research to show that's really hard for students to understand. And actually, this might be a better representation. But this is the one that we usually see. Why? Any guesses? Okay, it has to do with the technology of print. A book would have to become very wide, or you'd have to have an extra page which would fold out. So chemists said, hey, we'll just put it in the corner. We understand, it's okay. So for chemists, it's okay. But for students, it's a problem. It's the technology of print which constrained it. And now you can go online. You don't have that constraint anymore because you can zoom in, zoom out. You can click on things. So you have all these different. Anybody with an interest in chemistry should go online and look for different representations of the periodic table. There are 3D representations. It's just amazing. Chemists are still creating new ones. But to all our students, we just show this one thing. It's hanging on the wall. That's Mendeleev's truth. Right? And yes, there is truth to that. Don't get me wrong. But there are also many different ways of representing those relationships, which I think we deny our students. So content and technology are also interrelated with each other. So where does all this happen, technology, pedagogy, and content? It happens within specific contexts. So if you have a one-on-one situation where every student has a laptop, that's a very different context than if you were in this lab in India, where you may or may not have internet connections, where children have to share these machines, or you have iPads in the classroom. Context means more than just the classroom. It can mean something like this, where in Missouri they tried to ban the use of Facebook in school. That's the context. That's part of the context. Or in Belgium, where they now allow access to the internet when students are taking tests. So I find that very interesting. And I was looking that up, and it turns out that this is a statement from the ministry where it says that some of the steps taken to avoid cheating were, for example, ask how and why rather than when or who questions. And I said, that's awesome, right? That's what we want. And the change happened not because somebody said this is better educationally. The change happened because the technology came in, and then the when or who questions became too stupid because you could just look it up, right? So I find that kind of change in that way, how insidiously technology can come in and change our practices, to be quite interesting. It doesn't always have to be positive, of course. So what does this mean? So far we have these three things and context, right? And the most important overlap is when you bring those in. And if you look at that point at the center, we argue that all education sort of happens at that point. As educators, we live at the intersection of something that we want to teach, some approaches that we have, and tools and technologies that are with us. And so when we first wrote about it, we called it the TPCK framework. And that was not very easy to pronounce. So our friends suggested things like toothpick framework. So I don't know how many of you have seen this. There's a game show. What is that game show called where you have to guess letters and figure out the word? What's that called? Wheel of Fortune, thank you. So in Wheel of Fortune, if you want to buy a vowel, you can pay $50. So we paid $50 and we bought a vowel. And so the TPCK framework became the TPACK framework. We wrote a grant for that, just for that. So with the TPACK framework, another way of thinking about it is sort of talk about sort of the total package of knowledge, right? So that was sort of marketing speak. But the main thing here is that whether you're using a chalkboard, because when we talk about technology, paper and pencil is a technology, we talked about, this was mentioned yesterday, a digital computer is a technology. In fact, the ones that we don't call technologies are the ones that have become transparent to us, but they still are technologies. So whether you're using a chalkboard or a computer or the World Wide Web, we argue that teaching is always about TPACK. That it's always about something that you want to convey, some tools and technologies that we have, and some pedagogical techniques that we have. But it's at the coming together of those that's the most powerful thing. If they're separate from each other, then it doesn't work. It's that integration, it's that creative integration that is really important. Quickly, a little bit of history. I'm going to go through this fast. Again, apologies to the people in the back who are translating. We wrote the first article in 2006. If you're interested, there's a handbook of TPACK. Matt and I are not involved. We wrote the first chapter for it, but we're not involved in editing it. So it's not like we're making money if you buy it. So the number of citations of the 2006 article have really been phenomenal. And it's really wonderful as an academic when you write something and people across the world are reading it. It's been pretty influential both in terms of research and practice across the world. Some organizations that have been using it, don't want to go into all that detail. Different places have been using it for both for professional development of teachers, for teacher education. A lot of research, over 20 dissertations now use the framework as an analytic framework. So that's been really wonderful. If you want to know more about the framework, I would recommend going to tpack.org. It's a website that's maintained by Matt Koehler. There's also a listserv, a newsletter that you can sign up for. Archives of the newsletter are on my website. And it comes out, I think, 2 or 3 times a year, sort of just letting you know what are some key publications that have come out, what research presentations, so on and so forth. So not too much email. So one of the things that our research points to is what does not work. What does not work when it comes to teacher education or teacher professional development is seeing these 3 things as separate from each other. Okay? So if you have a course on technology where you bring teachers in and you say, we're going to teach you how to build a wiki. And then you say, okay, go and now figure out how to use it in your classroom. We find that does not work. That what does work, there are quite a few ways, is things that, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, but there's a lot of research literature out there now speaking about techniques which can help people develop this TPACK knowledge. And the way it typically is that you give them authentic problems in authentic context to solve, sort of like what the previous speaker talked about in terms of those design projects and so on. But I think this is sort of moving to the second part, after the TPACK stuff, is that for me the interesting part is not traditional practices that you do with technology, but how we can transform what we do with technology. That as a teacher, as an educator, I and others can change fundamentally what it is that we do. And for the longest time, people talked about using technology. And one of the things that you have found, Larry Cuban talked about it many, many years ago, that merely teachers using technology did not mean that they were using it pedagogically, that they were using it correctly or pedagogically sound ways in the classroom. So the focus for a long time has been on technology integration. So we talk about that a lot, right? How do we integrate technology in our teaching? But I think what the problem with the integration point of view is that it says, here is what I'm doing, and how can I make that more efficient or smoother or something, right? As opposed to using technology to innovate, to fundamentally change the way we think about representation of content, the way we think about student engagement with ideas with each other. I think those are very powerful ways that we can think about. So I'm going to give you 3 quick examples and then one little case study of a teacher of what they're doing. So this one is from a classroom, high school classroom in Italy, where they computed the distance to the moon. And the way they did that is by actually going to the NASA website and downloading, it's free, available to anybody, the communication between mission control and, let's say, Neil Armstrong up on the moon, right? Or down on the moon, doesn't matter, right, in space? Yeah, whatever, on the moon. And what if you listen carefully, you'll find that there is a slight echo, sort of like what you get when you call internationally, right? Where you hear a word and says, the eagle has landed, and if you listen carefully, you hear landed. Very faint, because the signals, electromagnetic signals, go to the moon and come back again, they bounce back. So what they did is that they got those signals, and they got them in this software program called Audacity. How many of you know what Audacity, have used Audacity? And Audacity is typically used to make, it's like Photoshop for audio, right? You can edit audio, people use it for podcasting. Now what this teacher did was used it as a data analysis tool. So you could zoom in, and you can actually see here, that's the main thing, that's the reflection. And there's a little gap in between. And if you zoom in, you can actually say how much time the gap is. Then you divide the time by 2 and multiply by the speed of light. That'll give you the distance to the moon. Mathematically very trivial, right? But conceptually quite sweet. And the level of accuracy that they had, they could tell, because the moon doesn't go in a perfect circle, as Kepler found out many, many years ago, the kids could see it for themselves, because when the moon was further away, the lag was a little more. To me, the most interesting thing here, it's a small project, it's interesting, is thinking about Audacity, which is an audio editing tool, thinking of it as a data analysis tool. That to me is creativity, that to me is repurposing. So if you're a teacher education program, if I come and tell you, you should teach Audacity, you'll say, oh, my curriculum is full. You're right. So, but it's not Audacity. For somebody else, it'll be some other tool. So what we cannot focus on are specific tools. What we have to focus on are ways of thinking that allow you to explore, create, and share these ideas with each other. This is a second example from my summer teaching this summer. And I was teaching about, we were talking about education as always and talking about educational tensions. In education we have top-down, bottom-up, breadth versus depth, online versus face-to-face, real, virtual, so on. And I always try to give students an activity which helps them think about that abstract idea in concrete terms. So I said, all of you have cheap, phone cameras or cameras, and there's a free website called Pixlr, which is sort of like Photoshop. So what I wanted them to make was pictures like this, where they had to photograph themselves and then integrate it into one picture. It takes around 15 minutes to do. It's very easy. Okay, but that way they learned a new technology, but they also had to think really hard about how to represent. So this one is isolated versus collaborative. It's the same guy, he actually got a wig so that he could, people had a lot of fun with this assignment, as you can tell. This one is planned versus spontaneous. Okay, so this was a fun assignment. It takes an hour to do. So we spend the morning discussing the readings. We talk about educational tensions, how we have to navigate them, blah, 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 all the good stuff. At the end of it, they come up with a Google Doc, which is just a list of these tensions. And in the afternoon, they're asked to represent them visually. Done. Now, this was one of my students in my class. She was not in jail. This is just a photograph we took for all the students. She teaches high school geometry. And a couple of months ago, she sent me this message on Facebook saying, I took this assignment and I used it to teach my students about reflection, translation, rotation. And they went and did it, and they were having a lot of fun around the high school doing this. So I think this is sort of a good example of how ideas can spread. But it's also a good example of how using something like Facebook allowed us to keep in touch with that. And so here is her comment that she posted on our Facebook group. So you can see, made for great discussions about transformation and isometry, and they've learned a little bit of technology too, right? So I think those are the kinds of things that I think, these are not big ideas. I'm not saying technology transformation in education sound like very profound. But I think the tools around us are so easy to use now. It really is our imagination that constrains us in many ways. The third example, this is in mathematics, 2 different examples. These are called dynagraphs. These are little applets that are out there on the internet. And so this is the representation of a function. So if you move that A will move along that line, B will move along with it in some relationship to A. So for instance, if fx equals, x equals, y equals fx, so if you move 1 unit, this will move 1 unit, right? If it's 2x, then if you move this one, this will move 2. Very simple. But the best part of it is that you can now, I've done this with my kids, and imagine teaching a mathematical function to somebody who's in 4th grade. It's not trivial, but actually it is, because what we did is my son and, to jump around now. So my son would walk, and I would walk along with him, and my daughter would be asked, what's the relationship here, right? And she'd say, oh, you're going at the same speed, okay. And then we would do something like, I would walk at 1 speed, and my son would walk twice as fast. So he's going twice as fast. And then you can bring up the applet, and then you see the idea of a mathematical function. Now it gets really interesting if you do the rounding function. Because the rounding function means I have to go so far, and my son will still be there till I reach 0.5. Then he jumps to 1. Then I keep going, and he jumps to 2. And so the function is walking like this, right? A mathematical function is a limp. That's a different way of thinking about a mathematical function, right? I think those are very powerful things. And now I've been recently working with Microsoft on some stuff that they're doing with the Kinect system, and I think it's just really, really interesting. So you can now hook up a Kinect system to a laptop, and they have software, this undergraduate student programmed it, where you can do geometry, like y equals mx plus b, you want to draw a line, and you do that by gesture. And suddenly mathematics, my son used to think I'm crazy because I'll tell him things like, you have to be the function. He says, what does that even mean? But yes, mathematicians talk about functions that way. Poets are words. We have to come up with a way of talking about education in ways that are honest and true to the people who do it. And so let's go listen to the artists, let's go listen to the mathematicians. And I think some of these tools allow us to do things in very powerful ways now. So ask yourself, what do these examples tell us? Would it have been possible 100 years ago, or even 10 years ago? Maybe even 5 years ago, how much of this would be done? And then the question is, what is it going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And see, that's how all this rhetoric that I hear about 21st century learning, it bothers me a great deal. Because imagine if you had to talk about 20th century learning based on the technologies we had in 1911 or 1912, right? That's the century where 1903, the first plane, the Wright brothers had the first flight. By 1950, grandmothers were flying across the Atlantic Ocean. And so we are sitting here in 1912 and thinking of Twitter and thinking it's like the coolest thing. Who knows what's going to happen in 50 years? But that's the world that you and I hopefully will retire into, and our kids will live in. I think that's a serious thing we have to be thinking about, right? As educators, that's the biggest thing really for us. So how do we prepare our teachers and through them our students? How much time do we have? 10 minutes? Okay. This quick case study of a teacher who I have really over time come to respect a lot. He and I met online. We didn't, he was blogging, I was blogging. He sent me email. We got to know each other. He grew up in this place called St. Joe, Missouri, and went to college and then came back home and is a high school teacher there. His wife is also a high school teacher. And I call him my soulmate, even though I think we finally met last year after having known each other for 5 years, which I think is really interesting. I grew up in India, this guy in St. Joe, Missouri, and we are like brothers, right? He does some really interesting things in his classroom. So one of his rules is that if you can't imagine anyone linking to what you're about to write, don't write it. So what does that mean? It means that if whatever you are doing, if it doesn't contribute to the larger conversation, why are you doing it? And he makes that a principle for his students as well. So he says, the assignments that I give my students have to contribute to a larger conversation in some way or the other. Okay? He maintains a Ning site. A Ning is like a private Facebook for his Principles of Biology class. And you can go look it up. You can type in on Google, Principles of Biology, Sean Nash, and you'll get there. It's completely open and public. Every conversation that he has with the students and so on, all the work that they do is all available there. You can participate in the conversation, but you will need permission from him to join the Ning. And I'm a member of the Ning, as, you know, because I was doing something with the students. So anybody can. People from over 160 countries have visited and looked at the work that the students are doing. And one of the big things that he has the students do is go out and explore. Using data probes and so on, they go look at the environment. He teaches biology, you know, local ponds and lakes, and they archive that stuff on the web. Okay? The other thing he has the students do is he has them create things and put it out there. So these were a bunch of representations they created for the Krebs cycle that his students created and put up on the internet. And one fine day, one of his students emails him and says, hey, Mr. Nash, do you know that this is now a link from a university website for educational resources? So a university had found this and said this is a useful resource for their students to learn. And he said, that scared the heck out of me, because now I was like, oh, I hope my students are doing it right. And so he had to go back to his students and say, listen, you guys better do it well, because other people are also seeing it. That's very different from doing a representation of the Krebs cycle and handing it to the instructor. He does really strange things. So he also had these students write this SciPo, which is like scientific poetry. So they were taking ideas in science, and they had to write poems about it. And he has this lovely blog post about why this act of translating a scientific idea into poetry truly requires you to understand that idea. And as an example of how these things can spread, this was a maths professor in California who said, how come all these people are writing poems about science, nobody's writing poems about math? And so she set up this challenge, and now this was the challenge that she set up. And now there is this whole wiki book called Math Poetry, and you can see my name is there too, because I wrote a few. Okay? And so how these ideas can spread and go from this classroom to another to a resource on the web, which is about poetry and mathematics. And so this big idea there is exploring, creating, and finally sharing it with the world. So I'm not going to go into this one just from the point of view of time, because there's a video that I want to show. Very briefly, that was a story about how an author of a book that Sean Nash used in his classroom got in touch with the student and so on. So you can see how that goes. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of creativity, because I think that's something that's really, really important in today's context, where technology is changing really fast, where the relationship between technology and content is shifting, and so on. And so this idea of repurposing, because these tools are not designed for us, and so on and so forth, right? So I found this on a listserv somewhere where it said creativity and intuition are the primary tools for creating solutions when relevant information is short. So this is my 17th law of creativity, again a prime number, that relevant information is always short. That the field that we are in, education, we are never ever going to have all the information that we need, for a range of reasons. Because A, we work with humans. Humans are like really messed up. They're unpredictable, they do silly things. But that's who we are, and we have to learn to live with that. And the world is changing, the contexts are changing. Your classroom is very different from my classroom, right? Technology is changing. So for a variety of reasons, we will never have all the information. And so, this is a famous quote by William James where he said, psychology is a science and teaching is an art. And I think that's why teaching is an art, because we never have all the information, right? But very few people know that what the rest of the quote that he said. And he said, an intermediary inventive mind makes the application by using originality. That art comes from that originality, which is that intermediary inventive mind. And so building an intermediary inventive mind is what we need for learning in the new millennium. Okay? And let's see the time. 6 minutes. I'm going to skip a few because I don't think that's all that important. So one of the things that I've been working on recently, currently, my current work is in sort of a joke, in discipline thinking, is that how can you think both within the disciplines and across the disciplines? So it was great pleasure to be in Barcelona because a couple of my favorite people are from Spain, from around here. So for instance, I have been interested in ideas like, that the mathematical idea of 2, 3, 4 dimensions and so on. And to me, one of the most amazing representations of that is this painting. And I've always been incredibly impressed by that because if you see the 2 dimension in the ground, you have the cubes, you have the hypercube, but more importantly are the profound connections it makes between spirituality and what does it mean to be off this earth while aspiring for something. I'm not a very religious person, but I can get those ideas. And it's those kinds of connections that I think that we are not making enough of, that we are not providing our students enough opportunities to see the learning that they have as being part of a wider or deeper fabric. Another favorite of mine is this gentleman. It was a great pleasure. This is a picture I took a couple of days ago. Again, look at that willingness to play with materials. A willingness to learn from nature and put it back. Where are we giving our students opportunities to do that? I think that's sort of a large part of what I'm doing now, what I call the transdisciplinary habits of mind. Been working on this, so we look at different ways that cut across disciplines. That how can you see what a mathematician does and a poet does? They're fundamentally different things at one level, but another level, they are about perceiving the world. They are about seeing patterns. They are about abstraction. So this is sort of my current work. I call that deep play. So that's the new, after TPACK, post-TPACK, deep play is my new thing. And it's seeking to construct new ways of seeing the world, new approaches to using technologies to develop creative pedagogical solutions. So it's still connected with technology, with pedagogy and content, but I think the emphasis is a lot more now on creativity and innovation. So I want to sum up here. So we live in a new ecology where standard solutions don't work, and I apologize to the interpreters, this just goes like that. Creativity is the only solution, and we have to consider the total package, which is, the TPACK, and we get there. It's not magic, and it's actually a playful process of repurposing existing tools. Okay? It's not old wine in new bottles, because I think it's new wine, new bottles, I don't know, new champagne, So, I want to end with a commercial. There was a commercial that I saw on TV a few years back. And then some people emailed it to me and said, oh, have you seen this? And I saw that commercial, and I sort of liked it, but something bothered me. And this is the age of the mashup, so I made my own mashup of that commercial. And so I'm going to first show you the original commercial, and then show you the mashup of that. Let's see if the audio setting is right. Do we have audio from this? All right, let's try. No audio. I had audio, I know. Where did we go? You go away. One more try and then we'll move on. Okay, we move on. That's fine, it's no big deal. Those commercials are available on my website. When you have a chance, go take a look at it, the mashup and everything. So this morning when I was sort of just browsing the web, sitting over breakfast and reading up news, Facebook is going public. They're putting their IPO out and people are going to become billionaires and millionaires and all that. But somebody actually read through the IPO, and there are some sections in their declaration to Wall Street which have to do with their sort of philosophy. And I read that, and I thought that was kind of interesting, so I wanted to share that with you today. But before that, this idea of exploring, creating, and sharing. I think with these tools, we have to play with them because these tools are coming along too fast. The opportunities are crazy, but unless we play with it, we will never know. And it's not just about learning, it's about creating something and then putting it out there so that others can take from what we have learned. So here are some things that are in the Facebook IPO, and I thought they were very interesting for us to think about. So, it says, done is better than perfect. I think very often in education, we are looking for the perfect solution. And I think that sometimes that might be too much. That code wins arguments, that's another way of saying that give me a proof of concept, show me that it can be done, don't just talk about it. Move fast and break things. I think we are always very scared of breaking things. The riskiest thing is to take no risk, and most important, the journey is 1% finished. So there's still a long way to go, and I think that's cool. I'd started with these quotes. Hope got a chance to sort of explore the sort of broader unifying vision of technology. And again, it's not a finished vision, it's still 99% to go. But if anything I want to leave you guys with is this. I think that with technologies is we have to learn, try to keep exploring, creating, and sharing. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you to the people in the back. Thank you. Thank you.
Bien, un momento antes de salir, por favor, algunas cuestiones en relación a la continuación de la jornada. En primer lugar, ya sabéis, ahora tenemos el descanso, luego iniciamos las sesiones paralelas y de cara a la tarde, tened en cuenta las siguientes indicaciones, por favor. A las 3 de la tarde, recordad que tenemos esos espacios divididos. Vamos a hacer, ya explicamos ayer y ya vivimos ayer la experiencia de ponencias, conferencias sin preguntas, pero con un espacio específico de 3 a 4 para discutir directamente con los ponentes. Hay una modificación en relación al programa y es que se van a encontrar los dos ponentes juntos en la misma sala. Será la 404 a las 3 de la tarde. Al mismo tiempo, hay dos espacios más para aquellas personas que deseen participar en otra actividad distinta, como son el espacio de discute, hoy sobre alrededor de la pregunta si el sistema educativo realmente necesita un reset. Y el tercer espacio, que quizás ayer pasó un poco inadvertido, pero que es interesante también que podáis visitar, es la presentación de e-pósters en el seminario de filosofía. A las 4 de la tarde nos encontramos aquí para la mesa redonda. Vamos a hacer esa exploración mirada hacia el futuro y a partir de después del pequeño descanso las sesiones paralelas. Para aquellas personas que vayan a ir a la cena, pueden acceder a la dirección del restaurante en la página web del Congreso o en la Secretaría, y para llegar pueden hacer dos cosas, varias o muchas más, pero una es en metro, quizás es razonable, tienen línea 4, parada Villa Olímpica, y con 10-12 minutos ya llegan al restaurante. O bien la opción, si es desde aquí con un taxi, calculen que son unos 10-15 minutos. ¿De acuerdo? Hasta luego. Gracias a todos.
Pues bien, ¿qué les pareció? Bien interesante, ¿verdad? Bueno, por lo pronto, para seguir disfrutando de estas perlas del pasado, quiero que se suscriban, por favor, me retroalimenten. Ya saben, como les he dicho, con una manita hacia arriba, una manita hacia abajo, y eso a mí me sirve para darme una idea si es algo que estoy haciendo algo que les interese. Por lo pronto, muchas gracias por estar y nos vemos a la próxima.